On the morning of February 28th, 2026, the skies above Tehran turned to fire, and in that single moment, the entire map of the Middle East began to redraw itself. Not slowly, not over years of diplomacy, in hours, because what happened next was something that no analyst fully predicted, no strategy paper fully prepared for, and no regional power fully calculated before it was already too late. Iran, in its fury, did not just strike back at the people who attacked it. It launched a transformation. It forged out of fire and smoke the one thing that had eluded the region for decades, a unified Gulf. This is the story of how Saudi Arabia drew the line, how the 6 nations of the Gulf Cooperation Council, despite old rivalries, recent tensions, and years of divergent interests, stood up together and said with one voice, "Enough." This is the story of what Iran's missiles destroyed. And it was not the buildings they were aimed at. What Iran destroyed in those 36 hours of relentless bombardment was its own last claim to regional sympathy, its own last chance to play victim, its own greatest strategic illusion, the belief that the Arab world would never truly unite against it. It was wrong, and by the time the smoke began to clear, the Gulf was a different place than it had been before. Let us go back to the beginning. For most of the past decade, the dominant story in the Gulf was not conflict, it was caution. It was tension kept just below the boiling point. Iran and Saudi Arabia, the 2 great rival powers of the region, had spent decades locked in a Cold War that occasionally flared into proxy battles. In Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq. Iran backed the Houthis, Saudi Arabia backed the recognized government. Iran armed Hezbollah, Saudi Arabia armed the opposition. Iran whispered in the ear of militias, Saudi Arabia whispered in the ear of kings. But open, direct confrontation between Riyadh and Tehran, that was always the line neither side crossed, the unspoken rule, the thing that both knew would cost more than either could afford. And then, in March 2023, something extraordinary happened. Something that stunned not just the region, but the entire world. Saudi Arabia and Iran shook hands. They signed a deal, brokered of all places in Beijing by China. They agreed to restore full diplomatic relations. They reopened their embassies. They exchanged ambassadors. The 7-year Cold War, marked by suspected drone attacks, espionage, and the near-total severing of ties, appeared to be over. China's state media called it a new dawn. Iran's foreign minister thanked Beijing with genuine warmth. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman said nothing publicly, but let the deal speak for itself. The message was clear: pragmatism over ideology, stability over rivalry. Vision 2030, the Crown Prince's colossal plan to modernize Saudi Arabia and transform its economy, required peace. Constant war with Iran delayed that dream and threatened it every single day. The deal was not love, it was not trust. It was 2 pragmatic powers deciding that further escalation served neither of them. For 3 years, the detente held, imperfectly, suspiciously, but it held. And then came February 28th, 2026. The United States and Israel had been building toward this for months. The nuclear negotiations between Washington and Tehran had stalled, collapsed, and stalled again. Intelligence reports, later confirmed by American officials, indicated that Iran had been accelerating its enrichment program toward weapons grade levels. President Donald Trump, never known for patience in foreign policy, had spent weeks signaling that military action was not just possible. It was probable. On Friday, February 27th, Israeli soldiers stationed at military bases were quietly told not to order food deliveries to their headquarters, a strange instruction that intelligence analysts around the world would later recognize as the first public signal of what was coming. Israel's Air Force had reportedly issued an internal directive. The so-called Pizza Index, the informal measure of activity at military installations based on late-night food deliveries, went dark. Then, at dawn on Saturday, February 28th, 2026, the bombs began to fall. The operation was called Epic Fury. It was, by every measure, the largest Israeli military strike in the country's history. The targets were not random. They were precise. Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, Karaj, Kermanshah. The strikes hit Iran's missile industry. They hit its naval infrastructure. They hit its intelligence apparatus. They hit the senior leadership of the IRGC and the country's security services. Officials killed included the head of Iran's Emergency Command Intelligence and the head of the organization responsible for Iran's defensive innovations. And they hit something far more consequential than any weapon system. They hit the man at the top. Within hours, unnamed Israeli sources confirmed what would soon become official. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who had ruled Iran for 34 years, the ideological spine of the Islamic Republic, the final authority on every major decision the country had made since 1989, was dead. His compound had been destroyed. His body had been identified. Iran's state media, after hours of silence and confusion, confirmed it. He said it plainly. The goal was to eliminate threats from the Iranian regime, to destroy its missiles, to end its navy, and to urge the Iranian people to rise up and take their country back. He told reporters the military operation might take up to 4 weeks. He said he was open to talking with Iran, but added bluntly, "You should have talked last week, not this week." It was, in every sense, the beginning of a new era. The only question was, what would Iran do next? The answer came faster than anyone expected. Iran did not collapse. Iran did not surrender. Iran did not dissolve into chaos, at least not immediately. What Iran did was reach for every missile it had and fire them outward in every direction it could. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps declared that all American and Israeli military targets throughout the Middle East had become legitimate targets. All of them. No exceptions, no limitations, no restraint. And then they began firing. The first strikes hit Bahrain. The small island kingdom, home to the United States Navy's Fifth Fleet, the most powerful naval force in the Persian Gulf, absorbed a direct missile attack on the Fifth Fleet's headquarters in Manama. Parts of the building were hit. The footage circulated worldwide within minutes. Then Kuwait, then Qatar, then the United Arab Emirates, then Jordan. Then, with a cold and calculated decision that would prove to be Iran's most catastrophic strategic mistake, Saudi Arabia's capital, Riyadh, was targeted, as were sites in the kingdom's oil-rich eastern region. In 36 hours, Tehran launched weapons toward every significant U.S. military partner in the region simultaneously. The numbers that emerged from those frantic hours were staggering. Kuwait's air defense forces intercepted 97 ballistic missiles and 283 drones, nearly 400 weapons aimed at a single country in a single day. Qatar intercepted 18 ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. Bahrain shot down 45 missiles and 9 kamikaze drones. Jordan intercepted 13 ballistic missiles and 49 drones. The UAE reported 3 foreign nationals killed and 58 others injured. On the famous Palm Jumeirah in Dubai, the most photographed artificial island in human history, symbol of UAE ambition and modernity, smoke rose above a hotel. The iconic Burj Al Arab, one of the most recognized buildings on Earth, had its outer facade singed by debris from an intercepted Iranian drone. Jebel Ali Port, the largest container port in the Middle East, the engine of Dubai's commercial empire, the hub through which a significant portion of the entire region's trade flows, caught fire when debris from an aerial interception landed on one of its berths. Dubai media confirmed it, and then Dubai media confirmed that operations had resumed. The message that sent was just as important as the fire itself. The UAE was not stopping. It was not paralyzed. It was absorbing the blow and getting back to work, with fury building behind every calm official statement. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day, received closure warnings from vessels operating in the Gulf. Kuwait's stock exchange suspended trading. Saudi Arabia's main index fell nearly 5%. Qatar's benchmark dropped 2%. The global economy held its breath. And then Sinem Cengiz, a researcher at Qatar University's Gulf Studies Center, said something that captured the magnitude of the moment better than any statistic. For the first time in history, she said, all the GCC states were targeted by the same actor within 24 hours. Their long-standing nightmare scenario had happened. That one sentence carried decades of meaning. For decades, the Gulf states had feared exactly this. They had spent billions on American weapon systems, on air defense batteries, on military coordination, precisely because they knew this day could come. They had hoped it never would. They had negotiated, hedged, and appeased specifically to prevent it. And now it had happened anyway. Before we can understand what Saudi Arabia did next, we need to understand what Saudi Arabia had to lose by doing it. The 2023 deal with Iran was not just a piece of paper. It was a carefully constructed safety net. Saudi Arabia had agreed to it because Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman understood something clearly. As long as Iran was actively hostile to the kingdom, his Vision 2030 plan was vulnerable. The Abqaiq and Khurais oil facility attacks of September 2019, when suspected Iranian drones and missiles cut Saudi oil production by 50% overnight, had demonstrated that vulnerability in the most painful possible terms. You cannot transform your economy and present yourself to the world as a stable, modern investment destination when your oil infrastructure can be vaporized without warning. The 2023 deal had imperfectly reduced that threat. Iran had backed off Houthi attacks on Saudi soil. The two countries had resumed diplomatic relations. The Saudi ambassador had returned to Tehran. Trade discussions had begun. The relationship was not warm. It was not close. But it was functional. And functional was enormously valuable to a kingdom trying to build an economic future. By targeting Riyadh, Iran destroyed that calculus completely. It did not matter that the Iranian government told Saudi Arabia beforehand that its airspace would not be used against Iran. It did not matter that Saudi Arabia had honored that commitment and explicitly closed its territory to any attack on Tehran. Iran's missiles came anyway, into Saudi airspace, toward the Saudi capital, toward the Saudi government's seat of power. Every implicit understanding, every diplomatic gesture, every carefully worded agreement, gone in the time it took a ballistic missile to cross the Gulf. Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry did not mince words. They called the attacks blatant. They called them cowardly. They called them unjustifiable under any pretext whatsoever. They noted, with unmistakable precision, that these attacks occurred despite Iran knowing full well that the kingdom had confirmed it would not allow its airspace or territory to be used against Iran. The message was devastating in its simplicity. Saudi Arabia had played by the rules. Iran had not. And Saudi Arabia was done pretending otherwise. The kingdom announced that it had intercepted all Iranian attacks aimed at its territory. And then, in language that would have been unimaginable just 48 hours earlier, Saudi Arabia said it would take all necessary measures to defend itself, including the option of responding to the aggression. Including the option of responding to the aggression. Let that land for a moment. Saudi Arabia, which had brokered a peace deal with Iran just 3 years earlier, which had reopened embassies and restarted trade, which had spent enormous political capital building a relationship precisely to avoid exactly this moment, was now openly reserving the right to strike back. But Saudi Arabia was not alone, and that is what made this moment different from every confrontation between the Gulf states and Iran that had come before. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman immediately called UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed. The two men, leaders of the Gulf's two most powerful states, whose own relationship had been strained in recent months over disputes in Yemen and across the Horn of Africa, set those tensions aside completely. MBS expressed full solidarity with the UAE. He reaffirmed Saudi Arabia's readiness to provide all possible support to Abu Dhabi. The rift between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi that had been simmering since at least 2024, when Saudi Arabia had allegedly raised with President Trump the issue of sanctioning the UAE over its support for a Sudanese paramilitary group that was warring against the Saudi-backed Sudanese armed forces, was put on hold, not resolved, suspended, because something larger was at stake. The UAE issued its own statement declaring the Iranian attack a flagrant violation of its sovereignty and international law. Kuwait summoned the Iranian ambassador. Qatar condemned the strikes. Bahrain, which had watched its U.S. Navy host city absorb a direct hit, demanded accountability. And then, on Sunday, March 1st, 2026, the 6 foreign ministers of the Gulf Cooperation Council gathered, not in a conference room, not in a grand summit hall. Because airports across the region were closed, the meeting was conducted by video conference. But the weight of what happened in that virtual meeting room was anything but small. The GCC held its 50th extraordinary meeting. The foreign ministers of all 6 member states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and Oman, reviewed what their statement called the extensive damage resulting from the treacherous Iranian attacks. Damage not only to military installations, but to civilian facilities, residential areas, service sites, and the lives of ordinary people who had done nothing to deserve missiles falling from the sky. The statement they released was not diplomatic hedging. It was not carefully calibrated neutrality. It was a declaration. The Gulf states condemned the attacks in the strongest terms. They called them a grave violation of state sovereignty, a breach of international law, a violation of the UN Charter, a violation of the basic principles of good neighborliness. And then they said this: the GCC states will take all necessary measures to defend their security and stability and to protect their territories, citizens, and residents, including the option of responding to the aggression. There it was. The unified Gulf, speaking with one voice, not just defending, not just intercepting, reserving the right to respond, to strike back, to go on offense if Iran did not stop. Ryan Bohl, a senior Middle East and North Africa analyst at the RAIN network, told Breaking Defense exactly what this meant. If Iranian attacks continue throughout this week, he said, he would expect the Gulf Arab states to eventually participate in counterattacks on Iran. The UAE, he noted, would be one to watch, but so too might Saudi Arabia. They need to restore deterrence against the Iranians, he said. Sitting passively by and using up their air defenses will not accomplish that. The Gulf had arrived at a moment it had never reached before. Now compare this moment to what happened just 8 months earlier. In June 2025, the United States and Israel had launched a similar operation against Iran, called Operation Midnight Hammer, that targeted Iran's nuclear facilities. It triggered a 12-day conflict. And how did the Gulf states respond then? Qatar issued a statement expressing regret over the attacks on the sisterly Islamic Republic of Iran. Kuwait expressed deep concern over the targeting of Iranian nuclear facilities and implicitly accused the U.S. of violating international laws and conventions. Saudi Arabia's own statement called for restraint and efforts to avoid further escalation. Not a single Gulf state had cheered the operation. Not a single GCC government had openly stood with the United States. The language was careful, cautious, and deliberately neutral at best, and implicitly critical of Washington at worst. That was 8 months ago. The same countries, the same Iran, the same United States. Completely different response. Because this time, it was not Iranian nuclear facilities being struck. It was Gulf cities. It was Gulf airports. It was Gulf people. Civilians caught in hotels, children near schools, workers at ports, who paid the price for Iran's retaliatory rage. And no amount of ideology, no memory of shared Muslim identity, no political calculation about not wanting to be seen as siding with America, could survive the reality of missiles landing in Riyadh. What Iran's calculation had always depended on was this, that the Arab Gulf states would never truly unify against it because they could never truly agree among themselves, because they always feared American dominance more than Iranian aggression, and because the memory of shared religion would always complicate any full alignment against a Muslim-majority country. All three of those assumptions were shattered in 36 hours. The Arab Gulf states unified, not despite their differences, but because of the sheer scale of what Iran had done to all of them simultaneously. The fear of American dominance was irrelevant when American bases were the only thing standing between their capitals and the next wave of Iranian missiles. And the memory of shared religion was impossible to invoke when Iranian weapons were landing in the courtyards of homes in Dubai, near hospitals in Abu Dhabi, and in the capital city of the country that hosts Islam's two holiest sites. Tehran had miscalculated catastrophically. The world was watching. And the world was not quiet. The United States, speaking at an emergency session of the UN Security Council, was unambiguous. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said that the indiscriminate and unprovoked attacks by the Iranian regime on Kuwait, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Jordan, and others reinforced precisely why the initial strikes had been necessary. Those Iranian attacks, he said, hit not only military targets but civilian infrastructure. He added a line that the Gulf states took note of immediately. Those who stand with us must know that their security is not negotiable. The safety of our allies is not conditional, it is assured. The United Kingdom's Prime Minister Keir Starmer confirmed that British forces were active and British planes were in the sky as part of coordinated regional defensive operations. France's foreign minister called the states caught in Iran's fire countries being drawn into a war they did not choose. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz called on Iran to immediately stop its indiscriminate attacks and said the clerical regime's days were numbered. He also said he had been informed in advance of the operation in a joint statement with France and the UK. Europe was not sitting this one out. The European Union's chief diplomat warned that the Middle East stands to lose greatly from any drawn-out war. The EU moved to reinforce its naval aspides mission in the Red Sea with additional French warships, bringing the total to 5 vessels, as Iran's retaliatory barrage threatened maritime traffic across the region. The International Committee of the Red Cross warned of a dangerous chain reaction of military escalation. The UN Secretary-General condemned both the original U.S.-Israeli strikes and Iran's retaliatory attacks on sovereign states. Only Oman, the one Gulf state that had played the role of mediator in U.S.-Iran nuclear talks, and the one GCC member whose territory was notably not targeted by Iran, struck a different tone, expressing dismay at the outbreak of violence. Oman's foreign minister urged the United States not to get sucked in further, saying, "This is not your war." But even Oman's careful neutrality was notable only by contrast with the unified condemnation coming from every other direction. And even Oman participated in the GCC emergency statement. Even Oman signed on to the declaration that reserved the right to respond. Russia's Sergei Lavrov condemned the original U.S.-Israeli strikes. China's Wang Yi called for restraint. Pakistan's foreign minister strongly condemned the attacks on Iran. But none of that mattered to the people in the Gulf states who had spent 36 hours watching their air defense systems work overtime. Their skies lit up with intercepts, their ports on fire, their airports closed, and their stock markets falling. There's a deeper story here, one that goes beyond the missiles and the statements and the emergency meetings. It is a story about what happens when a strategy that has defined an entire region's politics for decades collapses all at once. Iran's approach to the Middle East had always rested on 3 pillars. The first was deterrence through proxies. Rather than fighting its enemies directly, Iran armed, trained, funded, and coordinated a web of non-state actors. The Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, Hamas in Gaza, that could project Iranian power and create pressure on opponents without requiring Iran to officially go to war. This approach had worked brilliantly for 2 decades. It gave Iran plausible deniability, kept its own military largely out of direct conflict, and created constant pressure points across the entire region. The second pillar was the expectation of Arab division. Iran had always bet that Saudi Arabia and the UAE would eventually fall out over their competing ambitions, and until very recently, it had been right. The two countries had diverged sharply over Yemen, over Sudan, over the Horn of Africa, over approaches to regional power, over a dozen smaller disputes that had steadily frayed the relationship between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. The third pillar was the assumption of Muslim solidarity. Whatever differences existed between Iran and the Sunni Arab world, the shared Islamic identity would always create at least some hesitation, some reluctance, some political cost to openly siding with the United States and Israel against a Muslim-majority country. This had played out every time before. Arab governments might quietly support Western operations, but they would never cheer them publicly. They would never invite the accusation that they were siding against a fellow Muslim nation. In 36 hours, all three pillars collapsed. The proxy strategy was neutralized because Iran's proxies were no longer the issue. Iran had fired its own missiles at its own neighbors. There was no plausible deniability. The IRGC had posted its own videos claiming the strikes. The Iranian Foreign Ministry had written letters to the UN explaining that it was exercising its right to self-defense. Iran had claimed full ownership of every weapon that had fallen on Gulf soil. There was no proxy to blame, no militia to point to. Iran had done this itself. The Bet on Arab division was destroyed because Iran had, with exquisite and terrible irony, unified the Gulf by attacking it. Saudi Arabia and the UAE were not going to let their rivalry continue when missiles were landing in both their capitals on the same day. Qatar was not going to continue its careful balancing act between Tehran and Riyadh when Doha's airspace was closed, and its military was intercepting Iranian ballistic missiles. Kuwait was not going to hedge when nearly 400 weapons had been fired at its territory in a single day. And the assumption of Muslim solidarity was obliterated by the simple, unanswerable fact that Iran had attacked the two holy cities' host country. It had fired on Riyadh, on the kingdom whose identity, whose legitimacy, whose very role in the Islamic world is inseparable from being the guardian of Mecca and Medina. Whatever theological or political arguments Iran's supporters might want to make about the justice of the original US-Israeli strikes, those arguments had no answer to the question, why did you fire at Riyadh? There was no good answer, and Iran knew it. So where does this leave the region now? The GCC emergency statement had reserved the right to respond to Iranian aggression. Defense analysts had flagged the UAE and Saudi Arabia as the most likely candidates for counterstrikes if Iran continued its attacks. The United States had assured its Gulf allies that their security was assured. UK planes were in regional skies. French warships were being dispatched to reinforce the Red Sea. The UN Security Council had met in emergency session and achieved nothing, which, in a region moving this fast, was itself a kind of answer. The immediate questions were military. Would the Gulf states authorize offensive action against Iran? Would Saudi Arabia's Air Force, equipped with some of the most advanced American fighter jets and weapon systems in the world, join the campaign? Would the UAE's formidable air defense and strike capabilities be turned toward Iranian military assets? Military analysts noted that Gulf states had already done more than intercept. They had dispersed military aircraft. They had hardened critical infrastructure. They had activated alternate command and control nodes. They had implemented widespread civil defense measures, shelter-in-place alerts, school closures, controlled public movement. This was not a passive posture. This was preparation for something larger. But the deeper questions were political, and they would outlast whatever military decisions were made in the days and weeks to come. What does this moment mean for the future of Iran's relationship with its Gulf neighbors? The 2023 detente was not formally declared dead. No one had explicitly torn up the agreement, but it was impossible to imagine what remained of it. Saudi Arabia had summoned Iran's ambassador. Iran had attacked Saudi cities. The embassies, reopened in 2023 as symbols of a new beginning, now stood as monuments to how quickly new beginnings can end. What does it mean for China's carefully cultivated role as regional mediator? Beijing had brokered the Saudi-Iran deal of 2023 with great fanfare, positioning itself as a new kind of global power, one that could solve problems America could not. That investment now lay in ruins. China called for restraint, but China could not restrain Iran, and that powerlessness was itself a revelation about the limits of economic leverage in a region where missiles were flying. What does it mean for Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030? The Crown Prince's great project to transform the kingdom into a modern, diversified, globally integrated economy had always depended on stability. The 2023 deal was supposed to buy that stability from Iran. Instead, Iran had made clear in the most violent possible terms that no piece of paper, no diplomatic gesture, no economic incentive would bind it when it chose to act. That is a lesson that will reshape Saudi strategic thinking for a generation. The kingdom's bet on diplomacy was not foolish. And what does this mean for the future of the Gulf itself? For the first time in modern history, the 6 nations of the GCC have been attacked by the same enemy on the same day and have responded with a unified political voice. The GCC, as an institution, has often been criticized for its inability to coordinate on the hard questions. on Qatar's 2017 blockade, on Yemen, on the deeper structural questions about collective security. March 1st, 2026 was different. The emergency meeting, conducted over video link because airports were closed, produced a statement that was not a diplomatic compromise designed to offend no one. It was a clear declaration. It named the aggressor. It enumerated the damage. It reserved the right to respond. The GCC showed, in that moment, that it could act like an alliance, not just an economic council, not just a forum for coordination, an alliance with the willingness to act. That shift, from institution to alliance, from forum to force, may prove to be the most consequential thing that Iran's 36 hours of missiles produced, more consequential than the physical damage, more consequential than the diplomatic fallout, more consequential even than the death of a supreme leader and the decapitation of an entire leadership structure on the other side of the Gulf. Because nations can rebuild buildings, they can repair airports and hotel facades and port berths, they can restore oil production and reopen stock exchanges and process insurance claims and replace glass in shattered windows. But they cannot easily undo the political transformation that happens when 6 countries discover together on the same day that they share a single enemy, and that the enemy is not afraid of them. That discovery changes everything. It changes military doctrine. It changes diplomatic calculations. It changes the willingness of leaders to spend political capital defending alliances that had previously seemed more theoretical than real. It changes the answer to the question that every Gulf state had been quietly asking for years. If the moment came, if Iran truly crossed every line, would we stand together? They answered that question on March 1st, 2026. The answer was yes. In the end, what Saudi Arabia drew was not just a line in the sand, it drew a line in the sky, through the smoke of intercepted missiles, through the emergency communiques and the video meetings and the phone calls between crowns, through the quiet and devastating realization that 3 years of diplomacy had bought nothing when the moment of truth arrived. What the Gulf drew together in those terrible 36 hours was a boundary between the world as it had been and the world as it now was, between the assumption that Iran's aggression would always be measured, always contained, always targeting American assets while leaving Arab capitals untouched, and the reality that when Iran felt existential threat, all those assumptions evaporated instantly. Iran had drawn the line first. It drew it with a ballistic missile over Riyadh. Saudi Arabia drew it back, with words that carried the weight of a unified Gulf behind them, with the promise, reserved, measured, but unambiguous, that if Iran continued, the Gulf would not just defend, it would respond. The Middle East of February 27th, 2026 no longer exists. A new one is being built right now, in the aftermath of fire and smoke and intercepted missiles, out of the wreckage of the old assumptions. Every strategic calculation that had governed this region for the past decade, every bet on Arab division, every assumption of Muslim solidarity, every plan built around proxy ambiguity, is being recalculated in real time. And at the center of that new Middle East stands a fact that Iran, despite all its missiles, all its fury, and all its strategic calculations, will never be able to undo. The Gulf is united. And Saudi Arabia drew the line.